We're going to get the latest now on those high-stakes nuclear talks with Iran. Secretary Kerry back in Switzerland this morning as the White House sends a blistering letter to the Senate overnight warning against any action that could tank the deal. This all comes amid the controversy over that Senate letter to the leaders of Iran. Here's Martha Raddatz.
President Obama taking his latest shot at those 47 Republican senators in an interview airing tomorrow on Vice News.
I'm embarrassed for them to address a letter to the Ayatollah, who they claim is our mortal enemy. That's close to unprecedented.
The uproar over the letter growing just 16 days from the next deadline for nuclear talks between Iran and the U.S. The letter warns any deal with Iran must be approved by Congress or the next president could revoke it with the stroke of a pen. Iran's Ayatollah firing back, saying it was a sign of Washington disintegrating. And now even some who signed it having second thoughts on the strategy.
Maybe that wasn't exactly the best way to do that.
But the man who wrote it isn't backing down.
We're simply trying to say that Congress has a constitutional role to approve any deal to make sure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon.
And Senator Marco Rubio took his defense of the letter and frustration with the talks even further, saying negotiations were hurting the fight against ISIS.
In essence, the way we've proceeded with our negotiations in Iran have impacted our trust level with these critical allies in this coalition.
Senator, that actually is flat wrong. Also, flat wrong. This is about a nuclear weapon potential. That's it. And the president has made it absolutely clear they will not get a nuclear weapon.
The White House is firm it does not need congressional approval for a deal at this point, but down the road, if the president wants to roll back sanctions against Iran, it might be a different story. For This Week, Martha Raddatz, ABC News, Washington.
Thanks to Martha for that. We're joined now by a key member of the Republican leadership, Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri. You signed the letter, Senator. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. And we just heard in that piece Senator John McCain saying some second thoughts about the strategy. Well, your colleague Ron Johnson also says now that it might have been done in a different way. Do you have any second thoughts?
No, I really don't, George. I think what was interesting here was how aggressive the administration reacted, how aggressively the Iranians reacted. That letter was essentially an op-ed. It was released in every paper in the country. It said what, frankly, I'd been saying for a year and what the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's been saying for 6 months, which is there is a constitutional role here for the Senate if you want this agreement to be permanent, binding, and long-term.
But one of the things you're seeing in the White House sending a new letter overnight to Senator Bob Corker, who did not sign the letter, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, suggesting that this letter could backfire, this action from Congress could backfire. And even if there's no deal, which is your goal right now, it will make it tougher to get the allies to go along with the crippling sanctions you want.
Well, no deal is better than a bad deal, and Senator Corker sent his own letter, which said, don't go to the United Nations instead of the United States Congress, and the president sent a letter back, and the Secretary of State said, well, you know, we're obviously going to have, I think it was the Chief of Staff said, no, we're going to have to go to the UN, but we'd prefer not to go to the Congress. I think that just denies the long-term stability that any agreement with Iran needs, and of course we've shifted so dramatically from where we started, which was no enrichment, no nuclear weapon, to now we're, okay, we want some time and space between when you could have nuclear weapons, and we're going to let you we're going to understand you're going to have capacity to do that. I think these negotiations have gone in a dramatically bad direction.
Senator, you say that no deal is better than a bad deal. Does that really hold if the allies blame the United States for undermining the deal and therefore don't go along with the kind of sanctions you're calling for?
Well, I think Susan Rice actually said the other day at the APAC conference, no deal is better than a bad deal. And in that case, I certainly agree. We are so far from where we started here, George, and I can't frankly imagine anything more destabilizing to the Middle East or the decades in front of us than a nuclear-capable Iran. Why we would be moving in that direction with now negotiating the months that you'd need between the time they say we can have a nuclear weapon and they would have one, or an end time when there's no restrictions at all. I assume what the administration is now playing for is hoping before you get to that end date, there is a better government in Iran that wouldn't want to continually destabilize the world. They're already largely impacting the events in 5 capitals that they have control over, but there are many capitals in the Middle East that are very, very concerned about what will happen, and they'll, George, want their nuclear weapon as well if we go down this path.
Let me turn to the controversy over Hillary Clinton's emails. You just heard John Call report this House Speaker John Boehner poised to announce a new investigation. Do you expect a new investigation in the Senate as well?
I don't know what will happen in the Senate. I do think this is reminiscent, just as the panel you had on was, of what the Clinton years were like. One of my favorite commentators last week said the Clintons could find a loophole in a stop sign. And I think we're reminded of what it's like when, in spite of what Mr. Carville says, the rules that apply to them, they clearly don't think are the rules that should apply to everybody else.
How do you respond, though, to critics who say that it's kind of rich for Congress to call for these investigations, to level criticism like that, when Congress exempts itself from the very reporting requirements that it imposes on other federal officials?
Well, the obligations of Congress here are different than the obligations for the Secretary of State. And in fact, the obligations for Secretary of State to have a record, to maintain that record, to know what that record was, are critical because that person is a critical negotiator, just like John Kerry is. But go back to the other point, they're a critical negotiator, but there is a constitutional process here that you have to go through. Let
me turn now to the situation in Ferguson, Missouri. Of course, you're the senator from Missouri. We saw this week those officers shot after the demonstrations, after the city managers decided to resign, the police chief decided to resign. What should happen now in Ferguson?
Well, you know, we need to look for everything we can to move forward. Ferguson and the country is better than it was 50 years ago when John Lewis led that march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but we're not nearly all we should be. We ought to be working on that. I think what happened this week goes back to August when so much sudden obligation was placed on how the police were responding to peaceful protesters and not so peaceful protesters after the tragic end of the life of Michael Brown and all the tragedy that brought on everybody involved. But we need to begin to look at how we move forward. You don't move forward by talking about things like the militarization of the police, which really is decisions that need to be made by the police of how they protect themselves and how they protect others in the hard job they have to do. And nobody's opposed to peaceful protest here, but at some point that protest needs to lead to what do we do about schools that need to work better than they're working and support systems for young men and women that need to be more than they are for people who don't have all the encouragement that they need and they don't wind up with opportunities. We need to be focused on how we move forward.
Senator Blunt, thanks very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.